Hello, I'm Alex. Welcome to Books and Booze. This time I'll be talking about The Alchemist by the Brazilian author Paulo Coelho. Also this time I'll be having a return to Macallan 12, which was also featured when I reviewed Animal Farm by George Orwell, because I'm going to make the case there might be some similarities between these two books. Salute. It always tastes like candied ginger to me for some reason. So, The Alchemist, in which we'll draw some parallels to Animal Farm, the sense that it is a fable about following your dream, is a 1988 novel by the Brazilian author Paulo Coelho. It is about a boy named Santiago who embarks on this journey to seek treasure near the Egyptian pyramids after he has this recurring prophetic dream about it. And on the way he meets different mentors, significant figures, he falls in love, and he learns the true importance of what it means to sort of improve oneself through spiritual experiences, which are framed as reading omens or understanding a unspoken universal language throughout the book. The novel starts in Spain, but then quickly turns into Sahara, Africa, in a caravan, and throughout the journey, Santiago meets various others who have different faiths than he does, including the faith of an Englishman who is studying alchemy. Once he reaches an oasis near the Egyptian pyramids, he encounters a famed alchemist who lives there, and that's where things get even more interesting, but that is the overall gist of the novel, and I'll encourage you to go read it, as it's absolutely wonderful. That's my first takeaway from it. For you, it's just go read this. It's wonderful. It's very approachable, very accessible, pretty short, as it is with fables. So you can read through it pretty quick in a couple sittings. I think that's what I did. And it's just a very powerful novel with a lot of wisdom. So go read it. I don't want to give away too much of the overall story, and that's where I'll leave that there. Paulo Coelho is an interesting figure. Originally a Brazilian lyricist, then turned novelist. He was in Jesuit school until he was about 17, in which his parents had him committed to a mental institution. From that mental institution, he escaped 3 times and then was finally released from it at the age of 20. From there, Coelho enrolled in law school, but then ended up abandoning that against the wishes of his family to go and become a writer, and was sort of a hippie figure. He traveled just throughout South America and the rest of the world, parts of North Africa, Mexico, and Europe, and during this time too, he started to make some serious money doing songwriting. He was kind of notable within the Brazilian songwriting scene. However, in 1986, Coelho walked a 500+ mile stretch of road in northwestern Spain called the Road of Santiago de Compostela. I hope I said that right. And on this path, Coelho claims he had a spiritual awakening, and he describes it in an autobiography called The Pilgrimage, and The Alchemist kind of becomes the metaphor for this experience in his life as well. That's to say that Coelho felt very well off in his life, and he felt very loved, but he ultimately states that he did not feel fulfilled around this time, which is why he wanted to become a novelist and a writer as opposed to just a lyricist itself. And he had a very lucrative career as a songwriter, so it was kind of this dramatic thing to shift into writing full-time, to abandon kind of this very well-off position that he had. And Coelho only wrote The Alchemist in roughly 2 weeks in 1987. He explained that he could write this at this pace because it was already written in his soul, is what he claims. So before I get into what I really dig about this, let's address some things that I didn't really like that much or not. Honestly, there's not a whole lot. If there's one thing I didn't like, is that I wanted almost more of this, but that might be for the best. Even though it's limited in its scope a little bit and stays kind of nebulous, maybe even open-ended or vague at times, that's what allows it to kind of be a fable and let it be more applicable to readers all around the world, which is why I think so many people have connected with this novel, including myself. The only other thing that I maybe wasn't as into is maybe at one portion midway through the novel, the alchemy thing is played up a bit. There's just a lot of explanation of what alchemy is, what it was, the practice of it. And it's just kind of a lot, and it kind of comes out of nowhere as opposed to the rest of the pacing of the novel, but it does lead to some really interesting juxtaposition in the story, which now we can get into the story itself and themes and things I otherwise did like about this novel. The Alchemist is a really simple story and premise, one that we all know. It's just a very cut and dry, simple hero's journey, but it's brimming with wisdom and a healthy dose of optimism, which is something I'm growing to appreciate more and more in my life. Yet I would also say it's a fairly realistic optimism that you experience through Santiago and sort of the people he encounters. Bad things happen, questionable choices are made by certain characters from time to time, and that does tend to influence the rest of the story and Santiago's life. But the focus on what I would argue is how perspective helps the character of Santiago and helps him evaluate ultimately what these choices are turned into, and in turn it's trying to encourage you to do the same. And even though there's kind of this central core philosophy to the novel of when you really want something and it's your biggest desire, that the universe conspires in order to make that wish come true, I think that could be misconstrued into sort of this passive idea about destiny and a lack of free will. Santiago has to actively pursue his desire and in turn his perspective of the situation over and over and over. So it's not necessarily this idea of a passive destiny as much as it is how active can you be in fulfilling that. For example, there's early on in the novel a very questionable moment where Santiago's journey is basically put on hold for an entire year, and he ends up working in a crystal shop. And he finds a lot of fulfillment in this experience, and he expands his material wealth greatly as opposed to his life as a shepherd in the beginning of the novel. He learns a new skill set, and he even gains a lot of wisdom and spiritual wisdom at that he kind of learns to speak this language that he believes is universal in everyone's spirit, and he can pick up on that to a certain degree in individuals. But he continues on, even though arguably at this moment there's a very good case posited by Santiago and the novel that this is an immense sense of fulfillment at this moment in his life. And this reminds me of another great aside in the book, which I think could easily be lost as well. The Alchemist does not make the case that you're a personal legend, which is sort of the desire or wish, the biggest thing, the calling in your life, is to be some grand thing. Though the main character might make it seem this way, the Alchemist shares all kinds of other instances in which there are shopkeepers, I think there's a candy maker, a baker, a camel driver, that are actually fulfilling their calling as well and experience the same sensation of fulfillment and sort of spiritual awakening that Santiago has without it having to be anything crazy. And I think if you're just kind of breezing through the novel, that's something that might be missed, but I think the book actually makes a really good case that something as simple as being a baker could be as powerful as this young boy going on this insane journey across 2 continents. And that's where another part of this comes into play, where at its core, The Alchemist is a fable, which leads to a lot of fun and a lot of kind of adventurous segments, and it has a lot of wisdom to be gleaned from it in the same sense that we talked about Animal Farm is sort of open-ended in that same way, where it feels like each chapter has a very concise idea that it wants to convey to you. But it's not necessarily the most complex literature with super eye-catching imagery and prose. However, I would also make the case that there's a lot of beauty to be found in its very, what I would call stone language. It's very cut and dry. This is the description of a caravan in which Santiago finds himself crossing the Sahara about midway through the novel. The caravan moved toward the east. It traveled during the morning, halted when the sun was at its strongest, and resumed late in the afternoon. The boy spoke very little with the Englishman, who spent most of his time with his books. The boy observed in silence the progress of the animals and the people across the desert. Now everything was quite different from how it was that day that he had set out. Then there had been confusion and shouting, the cries of children, and the whinnying of animals, all mixed with the nervous orders of the guides and the merchants. But in the desert, there was only the sound of the eternal wind and of the hoofbeats of the animals, even the guides spoke very little to one another. And there's a lot of moments like that that more so describe scenes in kind of an open-ended way that's not very specific. It's usually not the kind of imagery I'm drawn to in writing, but it does have a certain beauty to it, a certain flow. There's also a moment in the book where Santiago meets Melchizedek, who is a biblical figure in the book of Genesis, someone that Abraham meets in order to settle in a certain land. And it's a little bit open-ended about how Melchizedek is there, or even what he is at this point, as he clearly is some sort of spiritual figure, whether it's an embodiment of Jesus or an angel or something along those lines. He does talk about taking on different forms. And this is also where another one of the core philosophies in the book is presented. And this is because Santiago had recently traded a book, and he's having a very difficult time reading it. He can't seem to even get into it, and he hands it to Melchizedek, not knowing who he is at this point yet. But he then proceeds to tell him that the book is about the world's greatest lie. Quote, "What's the world's greatest lie?" the boy asks, completely surprised. "It's this, that at a certain point in our lives we lose control of what's happening to us, and our lives become controlled by fate. That's the world's greatest lie." And I think this is a really compelling sort of central tension to have throughout the novel. Is Santiago controlled by fate, or is he fulfilling it, or is he even more active than that? Spoiler, it's going to end up that he's, even more active than that. The Alchemist, to me, is just absolute pure metaphor for how one sees their faith actively working in their life. Coelho was a Christian, he was a Catholic, so it makes sense that he would also kind of proceed to see faith in a similar manner. And ultimately, it's also about how faith helps individuals relate and connect to others. There are multiple examples of how Santiago can connect with Muslim characters throughout the book, and even the Englishmen, which I would argue are all forms of faith. It's clear how someone like Santiago, who is a Christian, who's kind of the embodiment of Coelho, being Catholic, specifically Catholic in the novel, and Muslims, there's some clear lines to be drawn about how they can connect on faith. But the Englishman, in one way, who is very obsessed with alchemy, is doing the same thing, where he's relying on very ancient text in order to tell him how to fulfill certain tasks, in order to fulfill a calling that he feels drawn to, even though he is not ascribing it to God in any sort of way. It's interesting how once they meet another alchemist, that's a little bit complicated, if you will. And then this is all made manifest in the end of the novel with a very active relationship with God, or as the Alchemist calls it, the soul of the universe. And ultimately, I think that the book wants to get at this idea that there's a universal truth behind all these attempts, these three different attempts, to understand what is going on behind everything, what is faith, and what is actually dictating our callings and our fates in sort of this very physical realm. And it's using this sort of vague metaphysical language to do so, but me being a Christian and also Coelho being a Christian, it's very clear what that universal truth, which direction it's being pointed toward, especially by the end of the novel. Overall, this is a really light read. It is enjoyable, it is very accessible, it is very inspiring no matter what your background is, whether you have a walk of faith or not. It compels you to feel confident and optimistic in pursuing your dreams, which may in turn turn out to be what your calling in life is. So yeah, I super recommend this. I bought it for like $3 at a used book sale at a library, and it's becoming one of my favorites. It's just something I can point to people and say, hey, there's a lot of wisdom in this, and who knows where it might lead them. I could see how people from all backgrounds would glean something different from this. So yeah, I super recommend it. And salute to Paulo Coelho. Thank you for watching this book review. If you enjoy content like this, please subscribe. If you've read The Alchemist and you gleaned something totally different from it, let me know. What do you see it as a metaphor for? Is it something different than how, you know, faith works in your life and in regards to your calling or your fate, how faith works in that. Let me know if you got something different from it. I also have a lot of different more cultural analytical content, video essays on this channel, so if that also interests you, please go check out those videos. I'm always working on videos like that as well. And yeah, be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you all on our next exploration.